Hello, in this video I kind of want to finish off the series that I was doing in terms of talking about how I think critical teams should respond to Baudrillard when they're on the affirmative, especially Baudrillard style criticisms that really seep into the academy kit and are really focused on the form content distinction. And I kind of wanted to start this by talking and ending off talking about the different portions of the flow and how they're really affected by various critiques that come from Baudrillard. I think that considering this strategy is incredibly important, like I said before, because I think that it's something that definitely influences various arguments that people take up, even if they're not directly reading or really framing the arguments around Baudrillard. And being able to answer those components can not only show off just your ability to really answer arguments on a multi-level basis, but also can really make it good for your ability to develop forms of offense from different portions that really stick them to things that maybe they're uncomfortable with dealing with. So teams that do seep too far into Baudrillard, how can you kind of pull critiques or some of the tricks that you're learning in order to really make these critiques potent? And I think doing so is really important in how you're really just developing your responses to authors and arguments from postmodernism as a whole. And I think that it's particularly important for how I'll frame the rest of this video. I think when I'm thinking about the link debate and how I'm thinking about the link debate, I think that you should really focus on trying to create responses to link arguments that are based in some of the framing arguments that you're making before. If you really think that you're on point with your framing arguments at the top of the flow, then make sure that your framing arguments are all across every argument that you're making on the link flow, because then I think you really want to start trying to move towards winning why the way in which they're making their link arguments are more relevant to the status quo than your affirmative, and try to push that as an argument about why the kind of arguments and barriers that they're putting are inevitable to any type of politic, but that does not make the production of politic necessarily bad. And then I kind of want you to then start moving on something similar to what I've told a lot of policy teams against Baudrillard, which is using a lot of impact outweighs styles arguments to really make these make sense. I think when you're a K team, especially when you're talking about various forms of structural balance, it's less of an impact outweighs argument and a more of framing the debate that's can you make this comparable or fitable to the everyday lived experiences of how people are actually formulating their lives and responding to the world. Even if you think that these material resources aren't an overthrow of particular said system, could you say that these X, Y, and Z things are good or bad? How do we make evaluations about everyday practices that people have to take up, not just in the context of their survival, but in the context of just how they exist within the world broadly? And I think that being really able to just center the question of something not close to a survival debate, but something that really centers the debate on just how the standard that Baudrillard holds to in terms of what is and isn't radical, how that is able to be practiced and put into people's lives outside debate, and how people that are debaters take it up in their own lives once they leave debate, is a question that is really critical and asking when you're thinking about the link debate. And I think it's a place where you really want to push the other team, because I think it's somewhere where a lot of teams really lack in maybe asking some critical questions. I think that you should definitely try to hold some of the link arguments that they're making, not to examples that are outside of your affirmative, but examples that are just very much fit to something that is less about producing a particular a scholarship or study, but the ways in which people are literally supposed to think, produce, and exist within the world. And I think that those types of questions can really push them to reframing the debate and really hedging on some of the materiality debate that you're going to want both in your framing portion of the debate and in the impact comparison debates later on. And so then on both sides, really helpful. Additionally, I think on the permutation debate, this is a place where I think it can be definitely really hard, especially against Baudrillard teams that are reading something a lot closer to refusal, or just saying that the AF just itself shouldn't have been read, etc., things like that, because they kind of refute the possibility of the AF being liberatory regardless of what you say on the basis of content. And so a lot of the net benefits that you would normally draw really aren't as helpful. But I do think that there are really interesting arguments to make in terms of how your permutation might relate to being able to be the best middle ground between how we're able to actually make decisions on an everyday basis versus what we actually think is quote unquote liberatory. I always think that when I'm against Baudrillard teams, I try to make the solvency threshold for how the AF departs from the status quo by creating something that is more livable than trying to overcome every form of structural violence, because I think there are very few methods that you could offer in any debate that is going to solve every form of violence in the world generally. And so you just need to be able to have your judge frame what you think is the best kind of thinking is the best way to think about your solvency broadly, in order to kind of set a standard for how they should evaluate what is and isn't a net benefit to the permutation, and how permanent that is in relationship to the maybe possible benefits of the alternative. And I think that you should definitely be there there are ways in which we can refuse like the seduction of like feeling liberatory when these things are done, and like also being able to like create and evaluate various ways in which everyday practices are necessary for people's like livability, etc. And I think framing the debate through there can be a good place for you to win like interesting in routes to actually getting closer to a permutation. Additionally, I think in the impact comparison portion of the debate, this is the portion of the debate that I was saying before that I think you really need to drive home in order to make a lot of these other arguments make sense. I think a lot of the offense that you're doing on before is really pertinent to like really you winning why your AF is an important source of discussion. I think when you're doing impact comparison, you're thinking about the stakes of your AF as like multiple levels against this debate. Why is it important in the world broadly? Why is it important in the way that we think about the resolution? And why is it important? Why is it more important than the type of risks we take in possibly being seduced by like the liberatory feeling of like the affirmative form of study as a whole? Those being able to answer those three kind of central places is like really important to how you're able to like think about impact comparison and like comparing and like putting together how you want the judge to really think about your impacts versus like things that are kind of like less material in the way that they're thinking about it. Then I think it's incredibly important for you to be able to like early on be able to think how you can preempt ideas about like critiquing images of suffering. And I think that you can really push the question on them, to the onus on them to be like, if we cannot use suffering as a way to think about how we should like talk about violence or what constitutes suffering, then like how do we talk about the existence of violence as a whole? How are people's like experiences, etc., not silenced? And if they are silenced, why is that not important to the type of politics that we forward, etc.? And I think asking those types of questions is like really necessary for how you're able to push these teams on the impact comparison basis. And then I think on the alternative basis, this is a place where I think when paired with your impact outweighs arguments, you can really pressure the alternative to being forced to articulate something beyond refusal. When you have all these arguments that are built earlier into the different parts of the flow that really push the materiality and livability question onto the negative, and I think you can really force them in a position where the alternative either has to deal with them some level or has to win one really, really, really big framing argument that just means that none of this stuff that you're really talking about like particularly matters. And I think that can be like particularly damning or dangerous for the other team, because it can force them into making a lot of framing arguments that aren't really compelling on the basis of like you would have to basically cover them with no ink in order for them to like really, really hit home, or they would have to just be like incredibly clean. But either way, I think if there's not really a big unbalance on like the framing stuff that happens above, this is a place where you just want to impose similar barriers that they've kind of imposed on you in terms of your ability to like find a kind of emancipatory way of thinking about the world, and their ability to like be able to articulate an alternative that doesn't actually like result in the same type of violence that they're critiquing earlier on in the debate. And being able to do so is like incredibly important for how you're able to make this strategy make sense. Hopefully this video is helpful, and hopefully you'll keep tuning in for more in order to understand some of my kind of like more final thoughts about Baudrillard that I'll be doing soon. And yeah, thanks for watching.